On a night when the Montana sky pressed low and heavy with snow, Elijah Crow rode alone through the timberline, his horse's breath steaming like a warning he chose to ignore, because men like him had learned long ago that turning back was often more dangerous than pressing forward. Elijah was a widower, a former scout, and a man who believed that fate did not knock twice unless it meant trouble. The cabin light should not have been there, too weak, too lonely, flickering like a dying heartbeat in a wilderness that swallowed the careless whole. When he dismounted and pushed open the door, the smell of blood met him before the sight did, coppery and sharp, cutting through the cold. Inside, the world stopped. A woman lay on a narrow bed, her face pale as snow, her breathing shallow and uneven, dark blood soaking through makeshift bandages. Around her stood 7 children, boys of varying ages, thin, hollow-eyed, shaking, not just from the cold, but from the terror of knowing something precious was slipping away. One of them, no more than 12, stood protectively at the bedside, his small hands clenched as if he could will life to stay. The others watched Elijah like trapped animals, ready to bolt or fight. Elijah's instincts screamed at him to leave. In Montana, survival often meant minding your own business. No lawman would fault him. No grave would mark his absence here. Yet something in the children's eyes, the raw, wordless plea, cut deeper than any blade he had faced. The woman tried to speak, failed, then managed a whisper that barely carried across the room. "Please," she said, and the word settled into Elijah's chest like a bullet. He moved then, setting down his lantern, kneeling, assessing the wound with the calm of a man who had seen too much death to panic. She had been attacked, that much was clear. Likely days ago, bandits, drifters, wolves in human skin. The children spoke over one another in broken fragments, explaining how their father had died the previous winter, how their mother had kept them alive by sheer will, how no one came this far out anymore. Elijah worked through the night, boiling water, stitching where he could, praying where he could not. Outside, the storm worsened, sealing the cabin from the world. By dawn, the bleeding slowed, but the woman did not wake. Elijah sat against the wall, exhaustion creeping into his bones, staring at 7 lives that now somehow rested in his hands. He knew the truth even if the children did not. If he left, they would not last the winter. If he stayed, his life, quiet, solitary, carefully protected, would be over. Montana did not forgive men who made soft choices, or so he had always believed. As the fire crackled low and the first pale light crept through the frost-rimmed window, Elijah Crow faced the moment that would define him far more than any gunfight or trail he had ever survived. And if this story already has you leaning closer, feeling that pull between fear and compassion, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because stories like this only grow more powerful from here. When the woman finally woke, it was 3 days later, and by then Elijah had already made the choice he would never speak aloud. Her name was Margaret Hale, and her voice trembled with both weakness and iron resolve as she thanked him, apologized, and tried to sit up all in the same breath. He stopped her gently, telling her she wasn't going anywhere yet, and for the first time in years, he heard himself speak like a man who belonged somewhere. Margaret told him what happened in fragments over the following days, how a pair of men had come asking for shelter, how kindness had turned to violence, how she fought back long enough for the children to escape into the woods, how she crawled home bleeding and waited for death that did not come. Elijah listened, jaw tight, a familiar fire stirring in him, the same fire that once made him a feared scout and an even more feared gunman. But revenge was not what these children needed. They needed food, warmth, safety, and something Montana rarely offered freely: time. Elijah rode out when the storm broke, not to leave but to return with supplies, risking ambush and exposure, because he now carried more than his own life on his shoulders. Word spread faster than he expected. A lone man helping a woman, and 7 children on the edge of nowhere, was not the Montana way, and people noticed. Some offered help. Others offered warnings. "They'll drag you down," one rancher told him. "You can't save everyone." Elijah didn't argue. He simply kept going. When Margaret grew strong enough to stand, she watched him with a mix of gratitude and quiet fear, knowing what it meant for a man like him to stay. The children changed first. Shoulders uncurled, eyes lifted. Laughter, hesitant at first, returned like something remembered from another life. Elijah taught them to chop wood, track rabbits, read the land. At night, when the fire burned low, Margaret would tell stories and Elijah would listen, realizing too late that the walls he had built around himself were no match for a family that did not ask to be saved, only to be given a chance. Trouble did come, as it always does. The men who hurt Margaret returned in spring, drawn by rumors and unfinished cruelty. They expected fear. They found Elijah Crow. What happened spread across Montana like wildfire. Not just the fact that two men never rode out again, but that Elijah had stood his ground for a family that was not his by blood. Some called him a hero, others called him a fool. But the territory changed, just a little, because of that stand. A schoolhouse was built nearby. Neighbors checked in. The wilderness did not soften, but the people did. Years later, long after, Margaret's hair had gone silver, and the children had grown and scattered. Travelers would still hear the story of the man who chose differently, when no one would have blamed him for walking away. They said his choice shook Montana because it reminded people that survival alone was not the same as living. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that one decision can echo far beyond a single night, subscribe to the channel now. There are more stories waiting, and each one carries a choice that might just change how you see the world.